Asheville, North Carolina, is known for its natural beauty, mountain scenery, and cozy small-town atmosphere. In this quiet place, life flows slowly away from the hustle and bustle of big cities, where everyone knows everyone else and big scandals seem far away. However, behind the facade of calm and idle, there are secrets that can shake even the most stable family foundation. The Randall family, consisting of successful businessman John Randall, his new young wife Catherine, and two sons from a previous marriage, Daniel and Thomas, were considered an example of stability and prosperity. John owned a large construction company that worked throughout the state, and his name commanded respect not only among his colleagues but also among local residents. After his first wife died tragically in a car accident several years ago, John could not find the strength to move on for a long time. But the appearance of Catherine, a woman full of energy and charm, became the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Catherine was 20 years younger than John. She attracted attention with her elegance and her ability to hold herself in society. However, many found it strange how she managed to win the widower's heart so quickly. For Catherine herself, this marriage was also a kind of win. She married a successful and wealthy man who could provide her with a carefree life. But what initially seemed like an ideal picture gradually began to show cracks. Daniel and Thomas were 28 and 24 years old, respectively, when they married. Both were already grown men, but they continued to live with their father in the large family home. Daniel, as the eldest son, followed in his father's footsteps and worked in his company, gradually preparing to take over the family business. He was serious and ambitious, with clear plans for the future. Thomas, on the other hand, was more of a free spirit. He changed jobs frequently, was interested in art, and seemed detached from the family business. But both brothers shared one thing: a sense of loss and sadness after the death of their mother, which made them attached to the family home and their father. Catherine's arrival was met with mixed reactions within the family. John, clearly in love with his new wife, hoped that she would be able to mend fences with his sons. But despite her efforts, tensions mounted. At first, it was in small ways: awkward glances at the dinner table, Catherine's forced smiles in the presence of John's sons, her attempts to make conversation that were met with cold responses. Daniel felt that Catherine had simply taken their mother's place, and this angered him, which he kept bottled up. Thomas, though he never expressed open hostility, felt alienated and out of place in this new dynamic. John himself did not notice these hidden conflicts. He was happy that he had found love again and believed that everything would get better with time. His days were spent working and caring for the well-being of his family, while internal passions and emotions began to slowly but surely destroy the very stability that he had so diligently tried to maintain. Catherine, despite her outward confidence, felt isolated. Her life had become a gilded cage where every day she tried to maintain the appearance of a happy wife, but inside she was increasingly weighed down by the tension between herself and her stepchildren. Her relationship with John, although it seemed ideal from the outside, began to cool. He spent more and more time at work, leaving her alone in a huge house that seemed alien to her. It was at this point that Catherine began to notice Daniel's gaze. It was strange, ambiguous, as if he was trying to say something but couldn't bring himself to. Every now and then their gazes would meet, and there would be a tension in the air that neither of them dared to break. Thomas, on the other hand, had become even more distant from Catherine, preferring to spend his time outside the house, avoiding both her and his brother. While John was making plans for the future and dreaming about how he would pass on the family business to Daniel, a dangerous game was brewing in his home that he had no idea about. From the outside, the Randall house seemed like a model of a luxurious and prosperous family nest. The large mansion, built on a hillside and surrounded by thick trees, looked majestic. The lawn in front of the house was always well kept, the pool in the backyard was sparkling clean, and the flower beds were a joy to the eyes of guests. However, this facade hid what was happening inside the walls. With each passing day, the tension between the family members grew, and this tension, like a hidden crack in the wall, began to slowly destroy their lives. Daniel increasingly felt like a prisoner of his own emotions. He tried to appear level-headed and professional to his father, but inside he was torn. As the eldest son, he felt responsible for continuing his father's legacy, and his role in the company was becoming increasingly important. John was gradually handing over key responsibilities to him, which only added to the pressure. But what tore Daniel apart even more was his strange and unsettling attachment to Catherine. She didn't seem to do anything special to win his attention, but every step she took, every glance, and every casual touch began to stir his consciousness. He couldn't figure out what it was that drew him to her: her youth, her beauty, or the fact that she was, in fact, forbidden fruit. Thoughts were forming in his head that he was afraid to admit to himself. Why should I give up my own desires just because she was married to my father? Every day they would meet at breakfast or dinner, and a silent play of glances would arise between them. Daniel began to notice that Catherine too was looking at him with some kind of vague interest, although she always tried to keep her distance. It seemed to him that she was deliberately avoiding him, but at the same time, he saw how her eyes lingered on him for a split second longer than necessary. Thomas, unlike his brother, was not as concerned with the family business. His interests were more free and distracted from the daily routine. He often found solace in books, the museum, and his own art projects. Thomas was an artist, a dreamer who preferred to express his feelings through art rather than words. However, he too could not help but notice how the family relationships changed after Catherine entered their lives. He did not feel the same rage as Daniel, but his attitude toward his stepmother was cold and distant. He tried to stay away from her, but a feeling of dissatisfaction grew within him. Being more sensitive and intuitive, Thomas sensed the underlying tension between his brother and Catherine, although he did not understand its depth. One evening, while John was away on business, Daniel returned home later than usual. The house was quiet, with only a dim light coming from the kitchen. He decided to peek in and saw Catherine standing by the window, a glass of wine in her hands. She seemed lost in her thoughts and, not noticing him, continued to stare into the distance. Daniel felt a sudden urge to go over to her, but something inside him held him back. He stood in the doorway watching her until she finally turned around and noticed him. "Are you home already?" Catherine asked in surprise, trying to look calm, although her voice was shaking. "Yes, I just arrived," Daniel replied, coming closer. There was an awkward pause between them. Daniel felt his heart beating faster than usual. Catherine, noticing this, looked away, pretending to be absorbed in her wine. "Has your father returned yet?" he asked, trying to defuse the situation. "No, he won't be back until tomorrow," she answered shortly, taking another sip. Silence filled the room again. In that moment, the tension between them was palpable like never before. Daniel took a step closer, and their gazes met again. He saw something in her eyes that was impossible to put into words, a mixture of fear, guilt, and maybe something else. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but for both of them, it felt like an eternity. "Good night, Daniel," Catherine said quietly, finally breaking the silence, and quickly left the room, leaving him alone in silence. This scene seemed to be a turning point. Daniel realized that he could no longer suppress his feelings. He tried to fight himself, convincing himself that this was wrong, that he had no right to feel such emotions, but the more he thought about it, the stronger his desires became. Meanwhile, Thomas, although he was not a witness to the scene, began to sense something strange. He noticed how Daniel was becoming more and more distant but also more nervous in Catherine's presence. Thomas was an intuitive person, and his artistic nature allowed him to sense subtle changes in the environment. He began to suspect that something was going on in their family that he did not know about. His thoughts began to revolve around Daniel and Catherine, but he could not yet fully understand what exactly was bothering him. Thus, the tension between the three main characters continued to mount, turning the quiet Randall home into a closed trap where each of them gradually lost control of their emotions. Nights in the Randall house became increasingly unsettling. It seemed that the silence in the mansion was not natural. It was electric, like a harbinger of a thunderstorm, and no one could find a logical explanation for it. Every step, every glance or accidental touch left a mark on the psyche of each family member. For John, it was something unnoticeable. He was busy with the affairs of his construction company, often going on business trips and believing that, as before, everything was fine. But he was wrong. Daniel could think of nothing but Catherine now. Her presence in the house became a painful ordeal for him, a reminder that his feelings were beyond the pale. Every time she entered the room, his heart began to pound, and his mind was thrown into confusion. Catherine, no matter how hard she tried to remain within the bounds of good, wifely behavior, increasingly noticed that there was something growing between her and Daniel that could not be ignored. One night, after everyone in the house had gone to bed, Daniel couldn't sleep. He wandered around the empty house, his footsteps echoing down the hallways, which were eerily silent. The moonlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Daniel felt like the house was becoming too small, as if the walls were closing in on him. He didn't know what he was looking for until he found himself at Catherine's bedroom door. He froze, aware of where he was, but something inside him wouldn't let him leave. At that moment, the door opened slightly, and Catherine appeared in the darkness, dressed in a light robe. She looked tired, but her face expressed a mixture of surprise and weariness. "Did you want something?" she whispered, looking at him as if afraid that someone might hear. "I just can't sleep," Daniel replied, avoiding her gaze. Catherine stepped back a little, inviting him in. It was a moment they were both aware of but could not control. As soon as the door closed behind them, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. They stood opposite each other, a thin line between them that was about to be crossed. Catherine came closer, her breathing barely audible, and her eyes betrayed what she had been trying to hide for months. She too had feelings for him that shouldn't have been there. "This is wrong," she said, but her voice sounded weak, as if she didn't believe her own words. Daniel didn't answer. His heart pounded so hard it felt like the world around them had disappeared. They were one step away from disaster, but they both knew it was too late to change anything. Before either of them could process what was happening, their hands touched, and that was the turning point. From then on, their meetings became regular, always under cover of darkness when the whole house was asleep. Catherine tried to keep her distance in daylight, but at night her heart and mind were dominated by her emotions. Each time they were together, their passion flared up more and more, and neither of them could stop this deadly whirlpool. However, Thomas, who had always been more sensitive to the moods and emotions of those around him, began to suspect something was wrong. He noticed how Daniel and Catherine avoided each other in front of their father, but when John was away, something in their behavior changed. Daniel became more tense, and Catherine became overly calm. One day, Thomas decided to test his suspicions. It was late evening. Thomas was reading a book in his room as usual when he noticed that Daniel, instead of going to bed, had left his bedroom and was heading towards the wing where Catherine's bedroom was. Thomas's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, but he couldn't ignore the fact. Thomas quietly left his room and followed his brother, trying to remain unnoticed. As he approached his stepmother's bedroom door, he heard muffled voices and silence that followed them. Thomas didn't dare look into the room, but it was enough to turn his suspicions into certainty. Now he knew that something forbidden was happening between his brother and his stepmother, but he didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Thomas felt like he was trapped and that whatever he did would bring disaster to the entire family. He was related to Daniel by blood, but he also knew that their actions could not go unpunished. Now that Thomas had revealed the secret, the tension within the family had reached a critical point. Thomas didn't know what to do, tell his father or hide the truth. He felt that his brother had fallen into a deep emotional hole and that Catherine was the main culprit of this fall. But the problem was that Thomas was also beginning to have strange feelings for Catherine. She seemed mysterious, inaccessible, but at the same time seductive. Thomas knew that if he did nothing, it would lead to disaster, but if he made the wrong move, everything would fall apart. Now he had to make a decision. Tell John, intervene himself, or perhaps become part of this forbidden game. It was from this point that events began to take on a new twist. Thomas found himself in a position where every step he took could have fatal consequences. He knew he was on the verge of destroying his entire family, but he was afraid that his own feelings for Catherine could push him to even darker actions. From the moment Thomas began to suspect an affair between Daniel and Catherine, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Thomas could not look at his brother without feeling a painful mixture of jealousy and disgust. His older brother, who had always been a role model for him, suddenly became an enemy, a man who had violated the unshakable foundations of the family. But what was worse, Thomas himself began to feel a painful attraction to his stepmother, which he could not explain. The days in the Randall household were spent waiting for something inevitable to happen, and the nights were becoming increasingly anxious. Catherine, who had initially tried to keep her distance, now realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. Her affair with Daniel had become a destructive force that could ruin them all. She felt like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and she couldn't figure out how to regain control. Torn between her duties as a wife and her feelings for Daniel, she spent sleepless nights filled with despair. Her emotions were as wild as a storm, and she knew that every passing day brought them closer to exposure. On one of those sleepless nights, Catherine finally decided to confront Daniel. She knew it was time to put an end to this madness before it destroyed them. It was late, and the house was enveloped in darkness. She waited for Daniel in her bedroom, her heart pounding as she thought about what she was about to do. When he arrived, he entered without a sound, and their eyes met. "Catherine, we need to talk," Daniel said, stepping closer, his voice tense. "Yes, we do," she replied, looking down. "This can't go on. We're playing with fire, Daniel. What if Thomas finds out? What if John finds out? I don't care about that. I want you, Catherine," he said fiercely, taking her hands in his. "I can't stop thinking about you. This feels too good to just throw away." "But at what cost?" she countered, pulling her hands away. "This isn't just a game for me. I love your father." Daniel's face darkened at her words. "You can't love him if you're here with me." Catherine sighed, feeling trapped. "What do you want me to say? That I'll choose you? That I'll leave him? I want you to be honest with yourself. What do you really want?" Catherine turned away, feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Could she really leave John for Daniel? In the shadows of the house, Thomas stood listening outside the door, his heart racing. He had to know what they were saying, but every word he heard only added to his internal conflict. He felt anger toward Daniel, but also a painful desire for Catherine. He was caught in a storm of emotions, unsure of what his next move would be. As the night dragged on, Daniel and Catherine continued to argue, their voices rising and falling like waves crashing against the shore. It was a battle of wills, but deep down, they both knew they were on a dangerous path that could destroy everything. With each passing moment, the tension in the house thickened like a fog, and it seemed that no one would escape unscathed. She knew that everything was falling apart and that now there would be no way to keep the secret. Thomas, standing in the doorway, suddenly felt a strange sense of power. He knew that he was in control now. "You know this is wrong, right?" Thomas said, his voice full of contradictions. Either he wanted to punish his brother or to be in his place. "You'll ruin everything. What will you do when Father finds out? You can't hide this forever." Daniel got up from the bed, his face red with anger. He walked over to Thomas and grabbed his hand. "You won't tell him," he said through clenched teeth. "If you say a word, you'll ruin our lives. You don't want that, do you?" Thomas pulled his hand back, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can keep me quiet? You think I'm just going to stand by and watch you turn our family into hell?" Thomas shouted, his voice echoing around the room. Catherine seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She stood between the brothers, trying to calm them down. "Please," she whispered, "let's not discuss this now. We need to think about how to fix this." But Thomas could no longer contain himself. His jealousy and desire for revenge overwhelmed him, and he stormed out of the room, leaving Catherine and Daniel in complete silence. Daniel looked at Catherine, his face distorted with anger. "Now he knows," he said coldly. "We can't go on like this. He'll tell Father everything." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, her body shaking. She knew the situation was critical. Her relationship with Daniel was destroying everything the family held dear, and now their secret was on the verge of being exposed. At that moment, she felt like there was no way out. In the days that followed, the situation only worsened. Thomas did not speak to Daniel, avoided seeing Catherine, and became lost in his own thoughts. He knew that he now had a secret that could destroy their entire family, but he also knew that his own feelings for Catherine were making the situation even more complicated. Soon after, Thomas, in a state of total confusion, tried to talk to Catherine alone. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a lot of questions to answer. He wanted to understand why she had chosen Daniel, why she couldn't stop. Perhaps, deep down, he hoped that she would feel the same way about him that she felt about his brother. They met in the back garden. Catherine was sitting on a bench, her face pale and her eyes tired. She noticed Thomas as he approached and sighed. She knew this conversation was inevitable. "I wanted to talk to you," Thomas began, sitting down next to her. "I know what's going on between you and Daniel, but I can't understand why you're doing this. Why didn't you stop this sooner?" Catherine was silent for a few seconds, then looked up at Thomas. "It's hard to explain," she said quietly. I tried to keep it under control, but it was too much for me. I can't change what's happened, but Thomas, you have to understand, I never meant to hurt your family. I'm just confused." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He looked at her, his thoughts jumbled together. It seemed to him that she was as much a victim of this situation as he was. "Have you ever thought about me?" he suddenly asked, not believing that he had asked this question. Catherine seemed surprised. She looked at him, her face taking on an expression of deep regret. "Thomas, you're a good man," she replied, avoiding a direct answer, "but things are too messed up right now. We have to find a way out of this before things get any worse." The events of the last week seemed like a nightmare for Thomas from which he could not wake up. He was crushed by the discoveries that made his life in the house unbearable. Previously, he considered Daniel his older brother, the one who always set an example, who guided and helped him at all stages of his life. But now everything had changed. The secret affair between Daniel and Catherine had destroyed his trust in his brother and completely turned his idea of his family upside down. Thomas felt his heart torn between betrayal and a strange jealousy. His attachment to Catherine had become painful to him. He could not understand what it was that drew him so much to her. But with each passing day, the guilt and desire to know the truth overwhelmed him more and more. Finally, he could no longer ignore what was happening and decided that he had to do something about it. He felt that the truth was too heavy for him to bear alone, and he needed to tell someone to relieve himself of this burden. Meanwhile, Catherine tried to continue her normal life at home, but her behavior had changed. She increasingly locked herself in her room, avoided talking to John, and seemed to be going through her own crisis. Despite this, her affair with Daniel continued. Their nightly meetings became more cautious, but the passion between them only intensified. Catherine felt more and more confused every time. She looked at Daniel. She was overcome by conflicting emotions: guilt towards John, fear of Thomas, and that irresistible force that drew her to her stepson. But Thomas wasn't the only one who had witnessed what was happening over the past week. John had also begun to notice strange changes in his family's behavior. He found it hard to ignore the increasingly strained relationship between his sons and Catherine. She no longer seemed the caring and welcoming wife he had known at the beginning of their marriage. Instead, Catherine had become more distant and cold. When John tried to talk to her, she made excuses to avoid important topics, which made him even more wary. One evening, when everyone was sitting at dinner, the silence was unbearable. Thomas and Daniel avoided looking at each other, and Catherine was playing with the food on her plate intently. John could not stand it any longer, and with a serious expression on his face, he put his knife and fork down on the table. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice even but with growing alarm. All three of them flinched. No one expected him to ask that question, and no one was prepared for the answer. Catherine quickly looked away. Daniel tried to hide his anxiety, and Thomas could barely contain his emotions. "What are you talking about?" Catherine finally asked, her voice unsure. "I can see that something is wrong. We all pretend that everything is normal, but it is not. I feel it every day. What is going on between you?" John looked at each of them in turn. Thomas felt his heart beat faster. He knew he should say something, but the fear was too great. He was afraid that if he revealed the secret, everything that was left of their family would be destroyed. His father was not ready for the truth. Thomas saw how much John loved Catherine and trusted his sons, and to break that trust seemed too cruel. But Daniel seemed ready to answer. He straightened up and looked coldly at his father. "Nothing's wrong, father," he said evenly. "We're all just a little tired. Everything's fine." John looked at him for a few more seconds, then nodded as if accepting the answer, although it was clear he was not satisfied. He stood up from the table, glanced at Catherine, and left the room. As John left, Thomas felt the tension in the room grow even more intense. He couldn't hold back any longer. There was an explosion brewing inside him that he couldn't control anymore. As soon as the door closed behind his father, he lashed out at Daniel with the fury he'd been building up for the past week. "How can you lie so calmly?" Thomas blurted out, his voice shaking with anger. "You're ruining everything. You know you can't hide this forever." Catherine jumped up from her chair, her face turning pale and her hand shaking. "Thomas, stop it!" she cried, but her voice was weak and unconvincing. Daniel stood up, his face red with anger but trying to keep his composure. "You don't understand anything, Thomas," he replied, looking his brother straight in the eye. "You can't interfere with this. You have to leave it as it is." Thomas shook his head, his eyes shining. "How can I leave this as it is? You're betraying your father. You're betraying our family. You're destroying everything we had." Catherine, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, took a step forward, trying to calm her brothers down. "Please, not now. John might come back." Her voice was full of fear. She knew that if they continued to quarrel, the truth would come out, and the consequences would be catastrophic. But Thomas couldn't stop. His mind was consumed with rage, and in that moment, he made a decision that would change the lives of their entire family. "I'll tell him," he said quietly, but his words sounded like a clap of thunder. "He must know the truth." Catherine turned even paler. She walked up to Thomas and grabbed his hand, her eyes pleading. "No, you can't. If he finds out, it will all be over, and you will ruin not only our lives but yours too." Her voice was full of despair. Daniel stepped forward, his face stern. "You wouldn't dare, Thomas. If you do, you'll lose everything. You have no idea what it will lead to." Thomas looked at his brother, his heart pounding and his mind racing. He knew he had a difficult choice: tell his father the truth and destroy his family, or continue to live with this lie. But he also knew that this lie was eating him up inside. "You can't stop me," Thomas said quietly, pulling away from Catherine. "Father needs to know the truth, and I'm going to tell him." With that, Thomas left the room, leaving Daniel and Catherine in shock. They realized that things were moving too fast and that they were no longer in control of the situation. After Thomas left the room, the atmosphere in the Randall house changed completely. He felt that he could not go back. The truth had to come out, no matter the devastating consequences. Thomas was worried that his family, whom he cherished, was on the verge of collapse, and the only thing that kept him from falling completely into the abyss was his determination to act. However, even this determination was fueled by his own hidden emotions and attraction to Catherine, which he tried to hide behind a mask of righteous anger. Meanwhile, Catherine and Daniel remained in the room, realizing that the situation had gotten out of hand. They stood in complete silence, aware that their secret affair was about to be revealed. But even in that moment, the tension between them did not disappear. Instead, their feelings only intensified, as if the forbidden fruit was becoming more and more desirable. Catherine was confused. Her feelings for Daniel were real, but they had crossed a line that could not be reversed. She tried to understand how they had gotten to this point and why her life had suddenly become so complicated. That evening, when everyone had gone to their rooms, Thomas was restless. He stood at his bedroom window and looked out at the moonlight that illuminated the back garden. His thoughts were chaotic. He knew he had to tell John everything, but at the same time, his mind refused to do so. Deep down, he still had the same feelings for Catherine that his brother did, but unlike Daniel, Thomas suppressed them, believing it was wrong. But suppressing these feelings was harder than he thought. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts about Catherine haunted him. There was a battle between reason and emotion in his head. He knew that Catherine was part of his family, his stepmother, and that these feelings were wrong. But with each passing day, his attraction to her grew stronger. This attraction was akin to poison, slowly seeping into his soul as the silence of the night fell over the house. Thomas suddenly realized that he could no longer fight his emotions. He had to talk to Catherine. Perhaps this was the only way to understand what was happening and, once and for all, break this dangerous connection that was destroying their family. Thomas, having made this decision, carefully left his bedroom and headed toward Catherine's room. He walked down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible, but every step seemed deafening. When he reached Catherine's door, he paused and thought for a moment. Should he go in? He knew that behind that door was something that could change his life forever, but at that moment, something inside him pushed him to make a decision. He knocked softly. At first, it seemed to him that no one answered, but after a few moments, the door slowly opened. Catherine stood on the threshold, her face surprised and tired. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" Her voice was weak, but there was concern in it. Thomas was at a loss for words. He looked at her, and everything inside him was boiling. In that moment, he realized how much he was attracted to her, but it was not just physical attraction. His affection for Catherine was deeper than he was willing to admit. "We need to talk," Thomas finally said, trying to remain calm. Catherine stepped aside, inviting him in. When the door closed, the atmosphere in the room became dense and tense. Thomas felt that every word, every movement, would have consequences. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Catherine remained standing next to the window, hugging herself. "I can't take this any more," Thomas began, avoiding her eyes. "You ruined everything, and Daniel, him too. I don't know what to do." Catherine was silent, her face a mixture of guilt and regret. She knew Thomas was right, but something inside her prevented her from admitting it openly. "You're right," she finally whispered. I made a mistake. But you don't understand, Thomas. It's not easy. I'm confused about my feelings." Thomas stood up abruptly from the bed and came closer to her, his eyes lighting up with confusion. His voice shook with emotion. "Are you confused? You ruined everything. You dragged Dan into this, and now everything is falling apart." Catherine looked into his eyes, her breathing quickening. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Thomas. But I can't deny that I have feelings for him too. It's wrong, I know, but what do you want from me?" Her voice trembled. Thomas stepped closer. Their faces were very close now. He couldn't hold back his feelings any longer. It seemed to him that Catherine was not just a woman, she was someone who filled the void in his life. You never looked at me the way you looked at Daniel, did you?" Thomas asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Catherine looked away, her face flushed. She couldn't give him a straight answer, but her silence said more than words. Thomas realized that he was always second to her, no matter what he did. The thought ate away at him inside. In a rush of emotion, he suddenly grabbed her hands and pulled her closer, their faces dangerously close to each other. "You don't understand, Catherine. You ruined everything. You ruined me. But damn it, I can't stand it anymore either." Thomas suddenly kissed her. Catherine froze for a moment, her eyes wide, but then, as if giving in to her own secret desires, she kissed him back. The moment seemed like an eternity, but it was filled with the same sense of forbiddenness that had filled her relationship with Daniel. However, unlike her affair with Daniel, her feelings for Thomas were mixed with guilt and fear. When the kiss ended, they both stood in silence, realizing what had just happened. "It was a mistake," Catherine whispered, pulling away from him. Thomas took a step back, trying to catch his breath. He felt that their relationship had gone too far. Things were even more complicated now. "I know," he answered quietly, lowering his eyes. After that fateful night, Thomas was at his wits' end. An inner conflict was destroying him from the inside. He knew his feelings for Catherine were forbidden, but they were too strong to ignore. Everything he had tried to suppress was now spilling out, and the kiss they shared only added to his confusion. Thomas was unable to accept what was happening. His mind kept telling him it was wrong, but his heart wouldn't let go. The days after that night dragged on painfully long. Thomas tried to act as usual, but every time he saw Catherine, his soul literally burst with mixed feelings. Daniel seemed to suspect nothing of what had happened between them, but he too became increasingly nervous and irritable. Their secret affair with Catherine, instead of bringing joy, was now becoming a source of constant anxiety. Any accidental word, any hint, could lead to disaster. Caught between the two brothers, Catherine was even more emotionally trapped. On the one hand, she was bound to Daniel by a passion that she thought would give her something he could not. On the other hand, Thomas, despite his youth and inexperience, had awakened in her the feelings she had tried to hide. She knew that her actions were destroying what was left of their family, but she could not break these bonds. Every evening, when the house was silent, Catherine relived the moment when she had given in to her emotions and allowed Thomas to kiss her. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling her life crumble before her eyes. She couldn't go back to her old life with Daniel. Her relationship with him had become dangerous, and Thomas, who now knew too much, was another threat to their future. Every morning, Catherine tried to act like a normal wife and stepmother, but inside she was seething. She knew she couldn't maintain this delicate balance for much longer. One night, when Daniel was away on business again, Catherine sat in the living room and watched the dying fire in the fireplace. The silence of the house was deafening. She hoped that Daniel or Thomas would not want to talk to her that night, but the tension inside her was becoming unbearable. And then, as if on cue, the door to the living room opened, and Daniel appeared on the threshold. His face was grim, and there was something in his eyes that betrayed his deep inner tension. He walked silently over to Catherine and sat down opposite her, his gaze never leaving her face. "Something's wrong," Daniel said quietly, breaking the silence. "You're not the same anymore. Something's changed between us. Do you want to tell me what happened?" Catherine didn't immediately find what to say. She understood perfectly well that Daniel had begun to suspect that something was wrong between her and Thomas. She understood that she couldn't lie to him forever, but she also couldn't admit what had happened between her and her younger brother. "I'm just tired," Catherine finally answered, looking down. "This has all become too much for me. I don't know how to cope." Daniel frowned, his face becoming even more stern. "You're lying to me, Catherine." His voice grew colder. "I feel like something has changed. You're avoiding me. You don't look at me the same way anymore. And Thomas, he's changed too. What's going on?" Catherine looked up, her breathing quickening. She knew she couldn't avoid the answer. Daniel was too smart not to notice what was happening. But she also knew that if he found out the truth, the consequences would be catastrophic. She tried to control herself, but the words just kept escaping her lips. "Daniel, Thomas knows," she finally breathed out, trying to hold back her tears. "He knows about us. He saw everything." Daniel froze, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "What?" he whispered, not believing his ears. "He saw us one night," Catherine continued, feeling her voice shake. "I don't know how long he's been watching us, but he knows. He threatened to tell your father." Now Daniel could not contain his rage. He jumped up from his chair, his face contorted with anger. "How dare he!" Daniel shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "That damn boy! He'll ruin everything. We can't let him do this." Catherine pulled back, her face filled with fear. She knew Daniel could be violent when provoked, and he was furious now. She tried to calm him down, but she knew the situation was getting out of hand. "Please calm down," she whispered. "We have to think of a way to resolve this peacefully. We can't do anything that will ruin everything completely." Daniel was in complete disarray. His mind raced from one option to another, but none of them felt right. He knew that Thomas had become a serious threat to his relationship with Catherine, and that they were now on the brink of disaster. He felt that his own brother had become an enemy that needed to be eliminated. At that moment, the door opened again, and Thomas appeared on the threshold. He stood silently watching them, his eyes betraying a mixture of pain, jealousy, and hatred. He already knew that his relationship with Catherine had been destructive, but despite this, his own feelings for her had not faded. He saw Daniel becoming furious and knew that conflict between them was now inevitable. "You already know everything, right?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet but threatening. Daniel stared at him, his hands clenched into fists. The tension between the brothers could have been cut with a knife. "You have no right to interfere, Thomas," Daniel said quietly, his voice full of hatred. "This is none of your business." Thomas stepped forward, his gaze full of determination. "It became my business the minute you destroyed our family," he replied, his voice firm. "You think you can continue this without fear of consequences? You are wrong." Catherine stood between the two brothers, her heart clenched in terror. She knew the situation was out of control and that she could no longer stop the gathering storm. The brothers, who had once been close, were now on the verge of a full-fledged feud. Thomas could no longer tolerate what was happening, and Daniel was ready to protect his feelings for Catherine at any cost. Tensions were running high in the Randall household, but for John, it was just beneath the surface. He had always been a man devoted to his work and his family, and he believed that the love he had for his wife and sons was the solid foundation on which he built his life. But in recent weeks, he had become troubled by strange changes in the behavior of those he loved most. John couldn't help but notice that Catherine was becoming distant from him. Her smile, which had once lit up the house, was gone. She often withdrew into herself, avoided direct conversations, and spent more and more time alone. When John tried to talk to her about her mood, she invariably brushed him off, citing fatigue or minor problems. However, John knew her well enough to know that something much more serious was going on. What worried John even more was the behavior of his sons. Daniel and Thomas, who had always been close, were now dangerously distant. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their conversations were short and tense. Each seemed to be avoiding the other, as if there was something between them that they could not or would not discuss. John watched them at the dinner table, where their conversations had once filled the house with joy, but now the silence was almost unbearable. Both brothers sat lost in their own thoughts, avoiding each other's eyes, and Catherine sat with a distant look as if she were in another world. Every night when John returned home from work, he was overcome by the feeling that something important was slipping away from him. He felt like the walls of his house, which had seemed strong and impregnable, were gradually crumbling. This house was a symbol of his success, the result of long years of work and struggle. But now, despite his material well-being, John felt that he was losing control over what was really important. One evening, after Catherine and his sons had already gone to their rooms, John sat in his study with a glass of whiskey in his hand and thought about what was happening. He reflected on the last few weeks, trying to understand what had changed in his family. He had always been proud of the fact that he had been able to create a strong union with Catherine after the tragic death of his first wife, and he had always believed that his sons, although they had not immediately accepted their stepmother, would learn to live in peace and harmony. But now something had changed. John remembered the glances Daniel and Thomas exchanged, the way Catherine avoided them in each other's presence, and how it made everyone tense. He could no longer ignore the fact that something was happening between his loved ones. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. These thoughts haunted him all night, and the next morning he decided to act. John was not one to solve problems with emotional talk. He was a man of action and direct approach. He needed to understand what was going on in his home, and he was not going to just sit back. The next day, John decided to return home earlier than usual to see what was going on while he was away. He wanted to make sure his suspicions were not unfounded, that his family was simply going through a temporary crisis and not collapsing before his eyes. He drove up to the house, parked the car quietly, and entered through the back door, trying not to make any noise. Everything was too quiet, and this silence made him wary. As he made his way into the house, he heard muffled voices coming from the living room. It was Catherine and Thomas. John stood frozen in the hallway, listening to their conversation. He didn't hear everything, but he caught fragments of phrases that made his heart clench with anxiety. "We have to do something about this," Thomas said, his voice strained and tense. "I can't live like this anymore. This has to stop." "Thomas, please calm down," Catherine replied, her voice shaking. "I understand, but now is not the time. We can't just destroy everything." John felt his insides boil. What were they hiding? What were they talking about? His suspicions began to grow at an incredible rate. He stood in the hallway, listening but hesitant to enter the room. His mind was torn between the urge to burst in and demand an explanation and the fear of learning the truth, which might be worse than he could imagine. But the situation suddenly ended. Thomas left the living room, and John quickly hid in the shadows of the hallway to avoid being seen. He watched as his son, a grim expression on his face, headed for the exit without looking back. John was left completely confused and even more worried. He could no longer ignore his suspicions. That evening, John decided to confront Catherine directly. He could no longer tolerate what was lurking beneath the surface of their relationship. When she returned to the bedroom, John wasted no time in asking her a direct question. "Catherine," he began, trying to remain calm, "what's going on between you and Thomas?" Catherine flinched at his directness. She stood in front of him, feeling her insides clench with fear. She knew John wasn't the type to ask questions without reason. He obviously suspected something, and Catherine knew she would have to either confess or lie. "Nothing's happening, John," she began, trying to remain calm. "Why do you ask?" But John was not satisfied with this answer. He came closer, his eyes full of seriousness. "Don't lie to me, Catherine. I can see that something is wrong. Thomas is acting strange. You are acting strange. There is something going on between you, and I want to know what it is." Catherine couldn't look him in the eye anymore. Her voice was shaking, and she knew she couldn't hold on for much longer. "John, please," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "It's not as simple as you think, but please don't make me talk about it now. It's too complicated." John felt anger boiling inside him. He had always believed that his family was a strong unit where everyone trusted each other, but now he realized that his trust had been violated. "If you don't tell me the truth now, Catherine," he said firmly, "I'll find out for myself, and then the consequences will be much worse." Catherine froze. She knew John wouldn't back down, but telling him the truth would ruin everything. And yet, she knew it was impossible to hide the truth any longer. Meanwhile, Daniel, who had returned home later, also began to feel that the tension between him and Thomas had reached its breaking point. That evening, when he was alone in the kitchen, he came face to face with his younger brother. Their eyes met, and the atmosphere became unbearably heavy. "You can't continue this, Daniel," Thomas said. his voice full of determination. "It's getting out of control." Daniel clenched his jaw, his eyes blazing with anger. "It's none of your business, Thomas. You have no right to interfere." "I have a right," Thomas replied sharply. "Because I too—" But before he could finish his sentence, John walked into the room. He stopped when he saw his sons in obvious conflict. His eyes narrowed, and he immediately knew something was going on between them. "What's going on here?" John demanded, his voice full of confusion and suspicion. Both brothers froze, unsure of what to say. John, feeling that all his worst fears had been confirmed, knew that the truth was close, but what he might learn seemed so terrifying that he was afraid to take the next step. John stood in the middle of the kitchen, his gaze darting between his two sons, and the tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Thomas and Daniel, who had always been a source of pride to him, now seemed alien. He sensed that something terrible was lurking behind their silence. Their recent behavior, the furtive conversations, the awkward glances, all of it pointed to something destructive happening behind the closed doors of his home. "I can't take this any more," John finally said, his voice cold as steel. "I want to know what's going on here, and neither of you are leaving this room until I hear the truth." Daniel and Thomas looked at each other, realizing that the moment of truth had arrived. They both knew that they could no longer hide the truth, but each of them was afraid that their father would not be able to bear what he heard. The silence that followed John's words hung in the air, weighing on each of them. John looked at his sons with such intensity as if he might explode at any moment. "Is anyone going to tell me something?" John demanded, his voice growing sharper. Thomas opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. His heart was pounding, and he didn't know where to begin. He looked at Daniel, expecting him to take the lead, but Daniel didn't seem ready for this conversation himself. Finally, Daniel stepped forward, his face set in cold determination, but his eyes were filled with fear. He took a deep breath and collected his thoughts. "Father," he began, trying to sound firm, "you must know that we, with Catherine—" He hesitated, his voice growing weaker, and the words would not form sentences. John frowned, his eyes narrowing. He knew this was about something serious, but he couldn't believe it had to do with Catherine. "What's wrong with Catherine?" His voice shook with tension. "What are you trying to say?" Thomas, seeing that Daniel could not continue, stepped forward, his face grim. "Father, it's true," he said quietly, trying to sound as collected as possible. "Daniel and Catherine, they're together. They've been meeting behind your back. I've seen them. It's been going on for months." The words broke the silence like a thunderclap. John froze, his eyes wide with shock, his face pale. For a moment, he thought he had misheard, that this was just a nightmare. But when his brain finally processed what had been said, he felt a storm of emotions rising inside him: anger, pain, betrayal. "What?" John whispered, his voice barely audible. That can't be true." But Thomas looked at him with such a serious expression that John knew it was true. He turned slowly to Daniel, his eyes blazing with fury. How could you?" His voice shook with anger. "How could you do this to my wife, to Catherine?" Daniel couldn't look at his father anymore. He knew that the moment he had been dreading had arrived, and now his whole life could be destroyed in a matter of seconds. "Father," he began, trying to justify himself, but his voice sounded strangled. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to betray you, but it happened. It happened," John roared, his voice echoing around the room. "It happened. You betrayed me, your family. You destroyed everything we had." John took a step toward Daniel, and Thomas, afraid that his father might lose control, stepped between them. "Father, please calm down," he tried to stop him. "We have to talk about this. It's terrible, but this is terrible." John could not contain himself any longer. "This is betrayal. This is something that cannot be forgiven. How could you, Thomas? How could you remain silent and hide this?" Thomas looked at his father, his heart aching. He knew he had told the truth too late, and that now it looked like a betrayal on his part too. "I wanted to tell you," Thomas replied, trying to explain, "but I didn't know how. I didn't know what to do." John clenched his fists, his face contorted with rage. He turned to Daniel, who stood with his head down. "You're not my son anymore," John said quietly but coldly. His words were full of pain and disappointment. "I don't want to see you in this house. You betrayed me and destroyed our family." The words struck like a knife into Daniel's heart. He stood still, knowing that it was truly over now. He had lost not only his father's trust, but also the chance of ever regaining his father's favor. "Go away," John continued, his voice full of bitterness, "and never come back again." Daniel wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He knew there was no turning back now. He turned slowly and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Catherine, who was hiding upstairs, had heard the entire conversation. She also couldn't believe what had happened. She felt like the world was crumbling around her. When Daniel entered her room, she saw his face contorted in pain. "He knows," Daniel said quietly, his voice full of despair. "He knows everything. I have to leave." Catherine froze. She knew this moment would come, but she still couldn't prepare herself for it to be revealed so quickly and so painfully. "I'll go with you," she finally whispered, approaching him. Daniel, despite everything that had happened, was touched by her words, but he knew their romance was doomed. What had once seemed like passion had now turned into destruction. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You have to stay here. It was my choice. I ruined everything. I have to go alone." Catherine looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she knew it was the end. Meanwhile, John remained in the kitchen, knowing that his life would never be the same. His son, in whom he had placed so much hope, had betrayed him. His wife, whom he had trusted, had been unfaithful. His entire family, his home, his life had all been destroyed overnight. Thomas stood silently by, unsure of how to help his father. He felt that even though he had revealed the truth, it had not brought relief. He now realized that the consequences would be far worse than he could have imagined. John sighed heavily and looked at Thomas, his eyes full of pain. "You did the right thing by telling me," he said, his voice weak. "But I don't know how to go on living now." The words sounded like a death sentence for the entire family. Thomas, despite his relief that the truth had been revealed, now realized that this was only the beginning of a new, much darker chapter in their lives. After Daniel left the house, the silence that fell over the Randall household was chilling and eerie. John, who remained in the kitchen, did not move. He was frozen, his gaze fixed on one spot, but his mind was torn between anger and despair. Thomas sat nearby, not daring to break the silence. The moment the truth came out, their world collapsed. Catherine stood in her room, crying silently, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. As the minutes turned into hours, the pain settled over the Randall household like a shroud, and each of them would have to find a way to cope with the consequences of betrayal. He cried, his voice shaking. "You destroyed our family. You betrayed me with my son. How could you? How could you look me in the eye and lie?" Catherine sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she knew she couldn't justify herself. All she could do was admit her guilt. "I'm confused," she whispered, her words sounding like a pathetic excuse. "I don't know how this happened. It all started so innocently, and I thought I could stop it." He looked at her with disbelief, his eyes expressing a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Innocent," he whispered, his voice full of sarcasm. "Innocent? You slept with my son, and now you're saying it's innocent? Do you realize what you've done?" Catherine couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She hung her head, covering her face with her hands. Her tears were a continuous stream. "I'm sorry," she managed to say through her sobs. I don't know what else to say. I'm just lost. I never meant for things to go this far." John stood before her, his heart breaking with pain. He wanted to scream, to smash everything around him, but instead, he felt his anger drain away, leaving only emptiness. He could no longer look at Catherine the same way. He knew their marriage would never be the same again. "You've lost me, Catherine," he said quietly, his voice full of despair. "You've lost our family, and there's nothing you can do to get it back." Catherine looked up at him with fear in her eyes. She knew this conversation was the end of everything they had. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. There was an emptiness inside her, just like there was in John. "You have to go," he finally said, his voice cold and distant. "I can't live under the same roof with you anymore. You've ruined everything we had." Catherine froze. Those words were a death sentence for her. She knew that after everything that had happened, she had no right to forgiveness. But hearing it from John, the man she had once loved, was unbearable. "John, please," she tried to speak, but her voice betrayed her. John didn't look at her. He turned away, trying not to show his emotions. All he could do now was preserve the remnants of his pride. "Go away, Catherine," he said, his voice hard and cold. "I don't want to see you again. Take your things and go." Catherine, realizing that there was no point in arguing, nodded silently. She rose slowly from the bed, her movements almost automatic. She knew it was over, and she had no choice but to leave. She packed her things into her suitcase, trying not to look at John, who stood by the window, not turning to face her. When she had finished packing, Catherine paused for a moment at the door, hoping that John would say something, that maybe there was a chance to fix everything. But he remained motionless. She realized that there was no chance anymore. Slowly opening the door, Catherine walked out of the bedroom and downstairs. Her steps felt heavy, and her heart felt like a stone. She passed Thomas, who stood at the front door, his face just as empty and broken. He didn't say a word, but their eyes met, and in that brief moment, they knew their lives would never be the same again. Catherine opened the door, and the cold evening wind hit her in the face. She knew that now she would have to leave, that her life would become a shadow of what it once was. As the door closed behind her, silence fell over the house once more. John, alone in the bedroom, felt his legs weaken, and he slowly sank into a chair. His hands were shaking, and his head was buzzing with thoughts. He had lost everything. Catherine was gone, Daniel had betrayed him, and Thomas had stayed with him, but their relationship could not be the same anymore. Everything he had built in his life was gone. Thomas, downstairs, stood at the window and watched Catherine walk away down the alley. His heart was broken, but he could not stop what had happened. He felt that the truth had to be revealed, but now he was oppressed by the feeling that it had destroyed not only his father but himself as well. After Catherine left, the Randall house fell into an oppressive silence. John tried to cope with the devastating pain that burned inside him, but no amount of willpower he knew could overcome the betrayal he had faced. His family, his life, his marriage, all had been destroyed overnight. The night was excruciatingly long. Every corner of the house, every piece of furniture reminded him of how much he had lost. The next morning, the silence in the house was still there, but it was no longer oppressive. In fact, it was frighteningly cold. Thomas knew he had made the right decision by telling his father the truth, but it did not bring him any relief. Every time he remembered his brother leaving the house, Catherine packing her things and leaving, he was overcome with pain. It seemed that no words could make it right. John was silent, avoiding communication with Thomas, and spent entire days alone in his office trying to figure out how to live on. John's inner anger did not fade, but now he began to be tormented by thoughts not only about betrayal. He was afraid that his family would never be whole again, that Thomas was also, to some extent, to blame. But most of all, John was tormented by questions. Where is Daniel now? What happened to him, and what will happen next? Meanwhile, Daniel, who had left home, felt that his life had finally collapsed. He rented a room in a cheap hotel on the outskirts of the city and could not find the strength to think about what to do next. He tried to justify his actions, but each time he ran into a wall of despair. He knew that he had made an irreparable mistake by betraying his father and dragging Catherine into this crazy affair. Now he had nothing, no family, no future. A few days later, late one evening, Daniel decided to go home. He needed to explain himself, to try to mend the relationship if that was even possible. Deep down, he knew that forgiveness was something he couldn't count on, but silence and leaving seemed even more cowardly. He arrived at the house in the dark. Everything was quiet, and there were no lights on in the windows. Daniel got out of the car and, walking up to the door, froze for a moment. He knew that misunderstanding, anger, and perhaps even hatred awaited him behind that door, but he could no longer hide. He gathered his strength and knocked. Thomas opened the door. When he saw his brother standing there, he froze, his face momentarily contorted with a mixture of anger and alarm. "Have you come?" Thomas asked coldly, not opening the door wider. "What do you want?" Daniel sighed heavily, his voice tired and depressed. "I need to talk to my father," he said, avoiding his brother's gaze. "I know what I did was terrible and that it may be too late to fix it, But I can't leave like this without trying to explain. Thomas stared at his brother for a moment, then stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The home they had once shared now felt strange and cold. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same. Daniel walked into the living room and looked around. Everything was in its place, but the house looked dead. It seemed as if all the life had disappeared from it in the last few days. John was sitting in a chair by the fireplace, but when he saw Daniel, his face tightened. The anger that had been smoldering inside him now flared up with renewed vigor. "You dare come back?" John said hoarsely, not rising from his chair. His voice was full of rage, but there was also deep pain in it. "After everything you've done?" Daniel hung his head, unsure how to start the conversation. "Father," he began, but his voice betrayed him. The words caught in his throat, and he couldn't speak. He took a deep breath and continued, "I don't know what to say. I can't justify my actions, I know that, but I want you to know I never meant to betray you. I don't know how this happened. It all got out of control." John stood up abruptly from his chair, his face distorted with anger. "You didn't mean to," he screamed, his voice echoing around the room. "You slept with my wife, my son, and you didn't mean to betray me? How dare you come here and say that to me?" Daniel couldn't look his father in the eye anymore. He knew that every word he said would only make the situation worse. "I know you'll never be able to forgive me," he said quietly, "but I couldn't just disappear without trying to explain. I had to at least try." John stepped closer, his eyes burning. "Explain." His voice was full of bitterness. "You destroyed everything. Do you think that your words will change anything? Do you think that you can make up for what you did?" Thomas, who had been standing on the sidelines all this time, decided to intervene, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. "Father," he said quietly, trying to calm John, "we can't go on like this. We're all desperate, and if we go on, it will destroy us completely." John turned to Thomas, his face softening for a moment. "Don't defend him," he said, his voice now low. "He's not innocent in this. He caused this pain. He should bear the consequences." Daniel felt ashamed, and the weight of guilt pressed down on him. He knew he had made mistakes, but he had to be honest. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice breaking. "But I will do everything I can to make things right. I'll leave if you want, but I need you to know that I didn't want this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." John was silent, his anger fading slowly, replaced by confusion and pain. "You've already hurt me," he finally said, his voice softer. "You've shattered my trust, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Daniel nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, unable to bear the pain of his father's gaze any longer. Thomas stood there, torn between his love for his brother and his anger at his betrayal. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his voice heavy with despair. "I just need to be away for a while. I need to think." As he stepped out into the cold night air, Daniel realized that he had lost not only his father's trust but his place in the family as well. He didn't know where to go next, but he felt like a stranger in his own life. John stood there, watching his son leave, his heart aching with sorrow. He knew that whatever happened next, things would never return to how they once were. The family was broken, and the wounds would take a long time to heal. Thomas felt his heart sink as he watched Daniel walk away. He knew that his brother was lost, and he couldn't help but feel responsible for everything that had happened. He turned back toward his father, who stood staring out the window, lost in thought. The silence enveloped them, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and broken dreams. They were both left to contemplate their shattered family, each feeling the burden of their choices and the consequences they would have to face. He turned towards the door, about to leave, but before he could take a step, John spoke again, his voice full of anger but also pain. "You think you can just leave like that," he said. "You think I'm going to let you just disappear after everything you've done?" Daniel stood frozen at the door, unsure of what to say. John continued, "If you leave now, it won't be the end. You ruined my life, and now I'll ruin yours. If you think you can go on living as if nothing happened, you're wrong." Daniel, frightened by the threats, realized that his father had no intention of simply letting him go. He knew John could be cruel when betrayed, But now he saw something more in his eyes, a desire for revenge. "I know I deserve to be punished," Daniel said quietly without turning around, "but if that's what you want, I'll take it. I've already lost everything I had." John was silent, and the silence in the room hung heavy. Again, he didn't know what else to say, but a storm was raging inside him. His son had destroyed his world, and now his own feelings threatened to destroy everything around him. After Daniel left, leaving an oppressive silence behind him, the Randall house was filled with dark thoughts and feelings that seemed to overtake everyone who lived there. John was consumed by a rage that did not subside but only grew stronger with each passing day. His life, his family, his trust in those closest to him, all of it was destroyed in an instant. He could not find it in himself to forgive the betrayal, and with each passing day, his anger degenerated into something darker, a desire for revenge. Thomas, on the other hand, tried to support his father, but fear was growing inside him. He saw rage taking over John, turning him into a man he had never known before. His father, who had always been steadfast and fair, was now consumed by destruction. Thomas knew that events had reached a point where control was lost, and now any wrong move could lead to irreversible consequences. But the worst came when John began to openly express his desire to punish Daniel. Simply banishing him from home was no longer enough, and even destroying the family seemed insufficient. John felt that the punishment should be more severe, and this thought took over his mind. His nights were filled with disturbing dreams where he saw himself confronted by his son, seeing his face full of fear and pain. He woke up in a cold sweat, realizing that he could no longer live with this feeling of inaction. One evening, when Thomas returned home from going for a walk, he found his father in the study. John was sitting at the table, his hands shaking and his eyes fixed on something in front of him. Thomas carefully approached and saw that there was a gun lying in front of his father. "Father," Thomas asked quietly, trying to hide the worry in his voice. "What are you doing?" John looked up at him, his gaze cold and focused. "I can't take this any more, Thomas," John said quietly, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of menace. "He's ruined everything. He has to pay for what he's done." Thomas froze in place. These words spoken by his father shook him to the core. He had never seen John like this. The feelings that were inside him went beyond simple rage. It was something deeper, something dangerous. Thomas did not know how to react, and his heart began to beat faster. "You can't think like that, Father," he began carefully, taking a step closer. "It's not a solution. You'll just destroy yourself. We've already lost too much. Daniel's gone. Catherine's gone. Don't add a crime to the mix." John shook his head slowly, his eyes full of pain and anger. "This isn't just betrayal, Thomas," he said, his voice growing louder. "This is the destruction of everything I've built. He needs to be punished for this. He needs to understand that I won't let him live after what he's done." Thomas felt fear creeping up on him. He could see that his father was serious and that his thoughts were already far gone. He needed to do something to stop him, but how? Thomas knew that anything he said could be perceived as weakness, and right now his father was too lost in his dark thoughts to listen to sound advice. "Father, please," Thomas begged, trying to sound calm even though he was on the verge of panic. "This is not the answer. You always said that violence is not the answer. You taught us that. Please don't do this. It will destroy you and us." But John seemed to have already made up his mind. He rose from his chair, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand, Thomas," he replied coldly. "I can't live with this anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. I see him laughing at me. I can't let him go. I won't just wait for him to destroy something else." Thomas felt he was losing control of the situation. He couldn't let his father commit murder, but it was almost impossible to stop him. John was too consumed with his anger to listen to reason. "Father," he began again, his voice shaking with fear. "If you do this, you will lose everything. Not only will you be depriving yourself of your freedom, but you will also be killing your last hope of making things right. Daniel deserves punishment, but not this. This is the path to the abyss." John turned to face him, his face contorted with anger. "You want to protect him?" he asked sharply. "After what he did?" Thomas was at a loss for words. He knew his father would no longer listen. John's anger had grown into something more, a real thirst for revenge that was taking over his mind and pushing him over the edge. Thomas knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let his father do something that couldn't be undone. He took another step forward, his heart pounding, but he was ready to fight to stop John. "I won't let you do this," he said, his voice firm even as he shook inside. "You won't kill him. That's not the answer, Father. I won't let you destroy our family any further." John looked at him with cold fury, but then something in his eyes changed. For a moment, it seemed as if his mind cleared. His hands clutching the gun trembled, and he took a step back. "What am I doing?" he whispered as if waking from a nightmare. He lowered the gun and sat back in the chair, covering his face with his hands. "What am I doing?" Thomas stepped closer and carefully took the gun from his hands. He placed it on the table and sighed heavily. He could see that his father was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but at least the threat of violence had been temporarily averted. "You made the right choice," Thomas said quietly, sitting down next to him. "That would have been wrong. We have to find another way to deal with this." John sat silently, his body shaking. He knew he had almost crossed the line of no return. Now he felt not only anger but also horror at what he had almost done. Thomas knew that this night would leave a mark on their lives forever. The family was already broken, but they almost went further down a path that could destroy them all. Despite Thomas's momentary stop in his father's tracks, the night when things finally spiraled out of control was just around the corner. The threat that had died down for a time was renewed as anger and resentment grew, filling the Randall household with dark energy. John, though grateful to Thomas for stopping him from doing something irreparable, could not help but think of revenge every time he remembered how his own son had betrayed him with Catherine. The anger surged again with renewed vigor. Daniel, meanwhile, was restless. He knew his father would never forgive him. He left home and wandered the streets, not knowing where to go. Everything he had was destroyed, his life seemed empty, and despair grew in his soul. He could not accept the thought that he had caused the destruction of his family, and he knew that now he had no home and no future. A few days after John and Thomas had survived that terrible night with the gun, Daniel showed up at the house again. He stood at the gate, watching the house from afar, hesitant to go in. He felt like it would be crazy to go back, but he felt like he needed to tell his father something. He knew he had ruined everything, but he couldn't stand by while his family was in ruins. Finally, he decided to go in. Daniel opened the gate and walked towards the front door, his heart beating hard, and every thought in his head was filled with doubt and fear. He didn't know how he would be received. Maybe his father wouldn't want to see him again, or maybe he would do something even worse. But despite his fear, he knew he had to try. When he entered the house, he found Thomas in the hallway. Thomas froze when he saw his brother, his face expressing surprise and alarm. "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked quietly, avoiding looking at Daniel. "I need to talk to my father," Daniel replied, his voice thick with guilt. "I know it may not change anything, but I can't leave without telling him what I should have told him a long time ago." Thomas hesitated for a moment, then nodded and motioned for his brother to come in. They walked into the living room where John sat, lost in thought. His face was tired and grim, and when he saw Daniel, his eyes flashed with anger. "You're here again," John said coldly, his voice low and steady. "What do you want?" "I want to talk to you," Daniel replied, his heart racing. "I know I hurt you. I destroyed our family, and I am truly sorry. But I can't live with this guilt anymore. I have to tell you how I feel. Why should I care about your feelings?" John replied bitterly. "You think it matters to me that you're sorry? You've ruined everything. You've taken away the only happiness we had." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know. I understand why you feel this way. I just want a chance to make things right. I'll do anything to prove it." "Prove it?" John scoffed. "You can't just take back what you've done. You can't erase the hurt. You don't even know what it means to lose everything." Daniel was silent, feeling tears well up in his eyes. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said softly, "but I want to try. Please, give me a chance. I want to make things right, not just for me, but for us." John's anger was palpable, but in that moment, he seemed to falter. Daniel could see the pain and the conflict waging inside him, and for the first time, he wondered if perhaps there was a chance for redemption. Daniel, John began, his voice breaking slightly. You don't know what you've done. You've taken everything I loved and shattered it. I know, Daniel said, stepping closer, his voice earnest. But I'm still your son. I want to be part of this family again. I can't bear to see us like this. We've all suffered enough. For a long moment, John looked at him, and Daniel could see the internal struggle reflected in his father's eyes. The man who had always been strong and stoic now appeared vulnerable, torn between anger and a desire to heal. Finally, John sighed deeply, looking away as if trying to hide his emotions. You think it will be that easy? He asked, almost incredulously. That we can just forget all of this? No, it won't be easy, Daniel admitted. I'm not asking for forgiveness right away. I just want the chance to show you that I can change. I want to work to rebuild what I've destroyed. John's expression remained unreadable, but Thomas, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. Father, he's right, he said, trying to mediate. We've lost so much already. What harm is there in giving him a chance? We can't continue living like this. We can't lose any more of each other. As they stood there, a heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel's heart raced as he waited for his father's response. He wanted desperately for John to see that he truly meant what he said. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John exhaled and nodded slightly. I can't promise that it will be easy, he said, his voice low and filled with weariness. But I will consider what you've said. We all need to think about this. Daniel felt a glimmer of hope as he met his father's gaze. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, but it was a start, a small step toward healing the wounds they had all suffered. Thank you, Daniel whispered, relief washing over him. I'll do whatever it takes. As they stood together in that moment, the shadows of their past still loomed, but perhaps there was a chance for redemption, for rebuilding what had been lost. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a path they could walk together. He realized that he had crossed the line of no return. What have I done? John whispered, his voice full of shock. He dropped the knife to the floor and stepped back, his eyes empty. Thomas, trying to stop the bleeding, knew it was the end. Daniel was dying in his arms, and nothing he could say or do could fix it. Their whole life had collapsed in an instant. Daniel looked at his brother, his breathing becoming ragged. Forgive me, Thomas, he breathed out, his voice weak. Forgive me. With these words, his eyes closed, and his body became motionless. Thomas, realizing that he had lost his brother, cried out in pain and despair. The house that had once been their refuge was now the scene of a tragedy that would destroy their family forever. The Randall home, once a place of peace and family, was now filled with silence, oppressive and unbearable. After Daniel died in Thomas's arms, life seemed to stop. All that was left was a bloody stain on the floor and shattered lives that would never return to their former state. John, standing over his son's body, could not comprehend what had happened. His hands were still shaking, and his eyes were filled with horror. He had killed his son, the one he had once loved more than anything in the world. His anger, his desire for justice and revenge, had led to irreparable consequences. Now that it was all over, he felt crushed, as if his soul had left his body. Thomas, kneeling next to Daniel's body, was in complete shock. He looked at his brother's lifeless face, and his mind could not accept what had just happened. Not long ago, they were a family, and although their relationship was complicated, now everything had collapsed completely. Thomas felt the emptiness take over his mind, consuming every thought, every shred of hope. "Father," Thomas whispered, not looking up from his brother's body. His voice was shaking, he was barely holding back tears. "What have we done?" John didn't answer. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on one point, as if he were unable to think or feel. Everything that had once mattered, their family, their home, their future, now seemed distant, like an illusion that had vanished into smoke. Thomas, realizing that nothing could be fixed, stood up and went to the phone to call the police. He knew it was over, and now they would face retribution. No more trying to fix the mistakes, only punishment for what had been done. His hands were shaking as he dialed the number. It felt like every step was difficult, like he was in a nightmare with no way out. 911, what's wrong? Came the operator's voice on the other end of the line. Thomas swallowed, trying to find the strength to speak. "We've had a murder," he managed to say. "My father killed my brother. You have to come." The operator on the other end of the line quickly began asking questions, but Thomas was no longer listening. He threw the phone on the table and sat down on the couch, holding his head in his hands. Time seemed to slow down, and he couldn't force himself to move or think. Everything that was happening around him was like a fog. When the police arrived, the house was filled with the sounds of sirens, footsteps, and conversation. The officers entered the house, immediately taking in Daniel's lifeless body and John's motionless form. John did not resist being taken into custody. He did not say a word as he was loaded into the patrol car. There was no longer anger in his eyes, only emptiness. He knew that retribution was inevitable, but it no longer mattered to him. All that remained was a sense of endless loss. The police questioned Thomas, but he was in a state of profound shock. He tried to explain what had happened, but his words wouldn't form sentences. He watched the officers take down his statement, but it felt like it was happening to someone else, like he was an outside observer of his own life. Days passed, but the pain did not subside. Thomas continued to live in the house, which was now full of ghosts from the past. Every corner, every room reminded him of the tragedy that had happened before his eyes. John was arrested and awaiting trial. Thomas was the only witness to what happened that night, and his testimony became key to the case. At the trial, John Randall made no excuses. He stood before the judge and listened to the accusations of murdering his son. He knew that he did not deserve forgiveness, and he did not try to get it. All his attempts to explain his actions were in vain. John understood that his actions were irreversible and the punishment was just. The judge handed down the sentence, a long prison term. Thomas attended every hearing, sitting in the courtroom and watching the proceedings. He tried to understand what had brought them to this point, but there were no answers, only endless questions and regrets. When the verdict was read, Thomas approached his father one last time before he was taken away to prison. He looked into his eyes, but he did not see the man he once knew. He saw a broken man who no longer had a future. "Father," Thomas said quietly, his voice full of pain, "I wish I could tell you that everything could be fixed, but I can't. We've lost everything." John looked at his son with bitterness. "You were right, Thomas," he said quietly. "Violence doesn't solve anything. I thought I could regain control, but I only destroyed everything completely. You must not repeat my mistakes. You must move on despite all this." Thomas wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He knew that life would never be the same for either of them, but he also knew that he had to find the strength to continue living despite the terrible tragedy that had happened. After the trial, Thomas was alone. The Randall house, once filled with laughter and life, was now a prison of memories. He often thought about what would have happened if they had done something differently, if he had been able to stop his father sooner, if Daniel had not taken that fateful step, but these thoughts brought nothing but pain. One day, a few months after the trial, Thomas decided to leave home. He packed his things and moved away, leaving behind everything that connected him to the tragedy. He knew he would never be able to forget what had happened, but he tried to find a new path in life, a path that would not be tied to the pain of the past. Years passed since the Randall house was shrouded in tragedy. Thomas, who left this cursed place, tried to start a new life away from the memories that haunted him. But no matter how far he went, no matter how hard he tried to forget everything that happened, the ghosts of the past followed him everywhere. Every night, he was reminded of that fateful evening when anger consumed their family and led to Daniel's death. Thomas had nightmares in which he saw his brother's face, terrified and bloody, over and over again. It seemed to him that with each new attempt to start over, he only sank deeper into despair. Thomas moved to another state, changed jobs, and started over, but inside him there was a growing feeling that he would never be able to live a normal life. His heart was filled with guilt for not stopping his father sooner, for not being able to save his brother, for the fact that their family, which once seemed strong and unbreakable, was destroyed. Guilt became his constant companion. John, who was serving his long prison sentence, spent years in solitary confinement reflecting on what had happened. He was no longer the proud and successful man who had once built his life and family. He was now a shadow of himself, a man who had lost everything for the sake of revenge. Every day in prison was a punishment for him, not so much physical as psychological. He knew that he would never get back what he had lost, and that the only thing he could do was suffer for his sins. Inside the prison walls, John was deep in thought about how one moment of weakness and anger could ruin an entire life. He no longer hoped for redemption, knowing that he could not forgive himself. Forgiveness from others meant nothing to him. The only person he truly wanted to forgive was Thomas. One day, as life in prison went on as usual, John received an unexpected letter. It was from Thomas, who, despite his own grief and guilt, had decided to write to his father. He had been gathering his thoughts for a long time, realizing that this letter could be the last link between them. In the letter, Thomas described all his feelings: pain, anger, despair. He did not look for excuses and did not expect answers from his father. He was simply trying to find a way to express everything that had accumulated in his soul over the years. He wrote that despite everything that had happened, he could not hate his father. In the end, they were both victims of their own lives. "Father," Thomas wrote, "I don't know if we'll ever understand what brought us to this point. I don't know if we'll ever forgive each other, but I do know this: we've both lost too much to continue living in the past. I'm not looking for forgiveness, and I can't give it to you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to move on, and maybe you can find a way to do that too." John read the letter for a long time, his hands shaking and his eyes full of tears. He didn't know how to respond, and he wasn't sure he could. The letter was an unexpected ray of light in the darkness he was living in. He realized that Thomas was trying to find a way to heal, and he wanted to support him, even from a distance. After much thought, John decided to respond. He didn't expect forgiveness but wanted to explain himself and express his sorrow. He wrote about how he was consumed by anger and could not see what he was doing until it was too late. He spoke of his love for Thomas and Daniel and expressed his deepest regret for what had happened. When Thomas received his father's letter, he was surprised by the depth of emotions that flowed from the pages. He never expected such sincerity from a man he thought was lost forever. The letters began a long correspondence that became a kind of therapy for both of them. They wrote to each other regularly, sharing their feelings, fears, and hopes for the future. Over the years, the letters became a way for them to rebuild their relationship, step by step. Although they could not change the past, they found comfort in knowing that they could still connect. They began to understand that they were not alone in their grief, that they could share their pain and eventually find a way to heal together. John's prison sentence became a long period of reflection and repentance. With each letter he received from Thomas, he found strength to continue fighting for redemption. He understood that forgiveness could take time, but he was willing to wait. Thomas, in turn, found a new meaning in life as he continued to write to his father. He began to understand that healing was not linear and that he could carry the memory of his brother with him while also allowing himself to be happy. He learned to appreciate small joys, friendships, laughter, new experiences. Years passed, and although their relationship was still fragile, both John and Thomas realized that their correspondence had changed them for the better. The bond between them, once torn apart by tragedy, began to slowly mend. They were not yet ready to meet face to face, but they were closer than they had ever been. In the end, they learned that forgiveness was not about forgetting but about letting go. They understood that they would always carry the scars of the past, but they were no longer defined by them. John and Thomas were ready to move forward, together and separately, in their own way, toward a future filled with hope.